A factory doesn't die with a bomb. It dies in silence, when the machines stop humming, when the lights flicker out, and when the workers pack up their tools and disappear into the smog. That's what happened in Guangzhou. One of China's industrial heartlands went dark, not because of war, not because of a pandemic, but because of a tax form signed in Washington. What could possibly bring down one of the most formidable manufacturing ecosystems in the world? And more importantly, who stands to benefit from its unraveling? Before we dive into the commentary, please like and subscribe to Worldview Today so you won't miss our unique takes on global current affairs. In early May 2025, the Biden administration announced a seismic shift, the termination of the de minimis exemption, a loophole that had quietly allowed millions of Chinese packages under $800 in value to enter the U.S. market tax-free. For over a decade, this obscure clause had been the oxygen tank for thousands of small Chinese factories, especially in apparel, electronics, and consumer goods. But now, the oxygen is gone. Within days, production lines in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Dongguan went silent. Business owners were left reeling. Workers were dismissed en masse. Warehouses filled with unsellable goods. The ripple effect spread through every layer of China's e-commerce ecosystem. Amazon sellers, Shein suppliers, Temu contractors, and independent exporters. A single policy decision in the U.S. had triggered the economic equivalent of a chain reaction detonation. To understand how this happened, we need to examine what de minimis really was. Originally designed for personal imports and small-value goods, the rule allowed packages under $800 to bypass U.S. import duties. But Chinese manufacturers and platforms like Shein and Temu weaponized it. They sliced large orders into micro-packages. They built lightning-fast logistics to drop ship directly to U.S. consumers. They avoided taxes, middlemen, and even U.S. labor laws. For American policymakers, this was no longer free trade. It was infiltration. The rollback of de minimis marked not just a tax policy change, but a declaration of strategic decoupling. It was a message: we are done subsidizing the rise of your factories with our consumption. Take the case of Dai Watch Club, a small Chinese company that sold customizable wristwatches to American consumers. It operated on thin margins, but relied entirely on tax-free exports to the U.S. Within a week of the policy change, 80% of its revenue was gone. The founder, Qin Lai, described it as a guillotine falling in broad daylight. His entire business model, dependent on bypassing duties, was invalidated overnight. So what happens next when a manufacturing giant loses its main buyer? Some tried pivoting. Qin Lai shifted marketing budgets to Europe. Revenue from the EU grew from 6% to 30%. Influencer campaigns were launched. Social media was weaponized. But Lai admits, Europe doesn't pay like America. The numbers just don't work. Others simply closed shop. Liu Miao, a factory owner who supplied garments for Amazon, watched 5 years of cross-border retail crumble in a matter of days. Once, his business thrived on volume. Small fashion batches sent directly to U.S. customers through Amazon's third-party platform. Today, his profit per shirt has shrunk from $1 to less than 50 cents after tariffs and new logistics costs. That's below the cost of shipping. He shut down his workshop in Guangzhou. Workers went home, the machines stopped. This isn't a story of a few unlucky entrepreneurs. It's an existential crisis for a massive sector of China's economy. According to interviews in Chinese media and regional surveys, thousands of small and medium-sized workshops, especially in textiles, accessories, and low-cost electronics, are closing. These aren't state-run giants or high-tech megaplants. These are the backbone of China's gray market e-commerce economy. They fed platforms like Shein, Temu, AliExpress. And they lived on the edge, cutting costs, dodging taxes, racing against time. De minimis was their safety net. And now, there is no net. Why does this matter? Because China's small factories don't just serve global demand, they create it. By flooding international markets with ultra-cheap goods, they shaped consumer expectations everywhere. Americans grew used to $5 shirts, $3 gadgets, $1 shipping. That era is ending. But the U.S. wasn't finished. Alongside the end of de minimis, Washington announced new tariffs on hundreds of Chinese products, from clothing and footwear to semiconductors and industrial parts. Customs checks tightened, shipping delays increased, environmental levies were introduced. The entire cost structure for sourcing from China shifted overnight. As one analyst in Shenzhen put it, the U.S. is no longer competing, it's waging a commercial war with surgical precision. The reaction in China has been confused and slow. Beijing offered token subsidies, minor tax breaks, and vague promises to boost domestic consumption. But it's not enough. The export machine that has driven China's growth for 4 decades is seizing up. Workers trained for fast fashion cannot simply become AI engineers, and local demand, though vast, is nowhere near enough to replace the American consumer. The consequences are global. As China's factories fall silent, supply chains fracture, prices rise. A $7 t-shirt on Amazon might soon cost $15. The inflationary aftershock will be felt across the US and Europe. Retailers scramble for alternatives, but there's no second China, not yet. So who fills the void? Vietnam, India, Indonesia, the ASEAN nations. All are scrambling to attract disillusioned investors, relocating manufacturers, and global e-commerce giants. Amazon is expanding logistics in Hanoi and Bangkok. Shein opened new factories in Vietnam. Temu is eyeing Malaysia. Even Chinese companies themselves are fleeing China, setting up made-in-Vietnam facades to dodge tariffs. Vietnam, in particular, has emerged as the frontrunner. With labor costs 30 to 40% lower than China's, free trade deals with the U.S. and EU, and growing political stability, the country has become the darling of global supply chain strategists. Tech giants like Apple, Foxconn, and Samsung have already made long-term bets there. For the next decade, Vietnam may be what China was in the 1990s, a production miracle waiting to explode. But even Vietnam has limits: infrastructure gaps, skill shortages, port congestion, and above all, the sheer scale of China is impossible to replicate. India, meanwhile, positions itself as the geopolitical counterweight. With 1.4 billion people, a massive domestic market, and growing ties with the West, India is attracting investment at record speed. Apple now manufactures iPhones in Tamil Nadu. Tesla is negotiating its first plant. Foxconn pledged over $1 billion in expansion. But bureaucratic hurdles remain. Red tape, land laws, labor inflexibility. India's future is bright, but not yet built. The bigger question lingers. Is this really the end of China's manufacturing empire, or simply the beginning of its transformation? Some in Beijing believe the empire can still be salvaged, not by fighting back globally, but by turning inward. The Chinese Communist Party is reviving its long-held ambition to pivot from an export-dependent model to one fueled by domestic consumption and technological self-reliance. It's a bold vision, but it also raises a critical dilemma. Can an economy built on mass production pivot fast enough to mass innovation before its social fabric tears apart? The answer is far from clear. To absorb the millions of workers now unemployed from shuttered garment and electronics factories, China would need to retrain and re-employ them in high-tech sectors like semiconductors, AI, and green energy. But education pipelines take years. Supply chains for advanced industries are fragile, and many of these new sectors, especially chip manufacturing, remain under crushing U.S. sanctions. In theory, China wants to become a second Silicon Valley. In practice, its industrial backbone still lies in stitching t-shirts and assembling plastic gadgets. Even so, Chinese officials insist that internal circulation, the concept of boosting domestic consumption to offset export losses, will eventually stabilize the economy. But that assumes that a middle class worried about job losses and inflation will start spending more. So far, there's little sign that's happening. The message is clear: China is cornered. And when an empire is cornered, it doesn't collapse, it mutates. The mutation is already visible. Chinese capital is going offshore. Companies are quietly relocating to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, not just to escape tariffs, but to rebuild leaner, more flexible supply networks. The goal is no longer global dominance, it's survival. The platforms are also shifting. Amazon, once the gateway for Chinese products to reach America, is losing its monopoly over cross-border commerce. Temu and Shein, while born in China, are building decentralized fulfillment networks that can operate from anywhere in ASEAN. Even TikTok Shop, once hailed as China's next e-commerce weapon, is struggling to make up for the lost volume from the U.S. market. Everything that once made China the default factory of the world, cheap labor, fast shipping, and tariff-free access, is now in question. The pain is real. In interviews with dozens of Chinese entrepreneurs in Guangzhou, many use the same phrase. The game is over, not metaphorically, literally. Some say it with anger, others with grief, most with exhaustion. Factories that ran 24/7 now sit empty. Districts that once bustled with delivery trucks now echo with silence. And the once fabled factory-to-consumer model, once the envy of the world, is now unsustainable. But perhaps the game isn't over. It has just changed, and the new rules are brutal. This is no longer a race for efficiency, it's a race for resilience. Global companies, scarred by COVID-19 disruptions, and now tariff wars, are looking for more than just low costs. They want stability, redundancy, legal transparency. That's why Southeast Asia is rising, not because it's cheaper than China, but because it offers geopolitical neutrality and diversification. But this transition won't be smooth. As production disperses, the economies of scale China once provided will vanish. Prices will rise, supply chains will tangle, and in the near term, global inflation may see another jolt, fueled not by pandemics or oil shocks, but by the logistical chaos of a new manufacturing order. Consumers in the West will feel it. The $9 dress may soon become a relic, so might the $20 smartwatch, the $15 kitchen gadget, the $5 pair of earbuds. And what does it mean for countries like Vietnam? This is the opportunity of a generation. But opportunity without preparation is just chaos in disguise. Vietnam now stands at a crossroads. On one path, it can become the world's next production hub, attracting long-term investments, building a robust supply chain, upgrading labor standards, and developing its own brands. On the other path, it risks becoming a temporary tax haven, a place where Chinese companies repackage their goods to skirt U.S. tariffs, offering low value add while keeping most of the profit offshore. The warning signs are already there. Some Chinese firms have set up shell operations in Vietnam just to gain a Made in Vietnam label. No real investment, no real transfer of skills. If Vietnam doesn't move fast to close loopholes, enforce standards, and demand long-term commitment from foreign investors, it could squander its moment. Vietnam's logistics infrastructure still lags. Ports are congested, roads are underdeveloped, customs procedures remain complex. If these bottlenecks aren't resolved, factories will relocate again, to Indonesia, to India, or even back to Mexico. And then there's the question of workforce. China's industrial miracle was powered by a generation of disciplined, cheap, and technically competent workers. Vietnam needs to train its own. That means vocational education. That means digital literacy. That means thinking beyond assembly lines. Only then can Vietnam not just absorb the factories of today, but build the factories of tomorrow. Meanwhile, the United States watches closely. In Washington, the demise of China's export dominance is not seen as collateral damage. It's seen as a strategic success. A soft decoupling is underway. Not with tanks, but with tariffs. Not through isolation, but through selective exclusion. It's an economic doctrine aimed at breaking dependence without triggering collapse. By forcing companies to diversify away from China, the U.S. seeks to reduce the geopolitical leverage Beijing once wielded over global trade. But this comes with risk. If the transition fails, if new supply chains falter, Western consumers will bear the cost. Higher prices, slower deliveries, uncertain quality. The world has entered a phase where there is no easy win, only trade-offs. And China? It hasn't disappeared. It's adapting, it's recalibrating. It's still the largest exporter of goods on the planet. And it's betting that once the dust settles, many companies will return, either out of habit or because the alternatives proved inadequate. But that is not a guarantee. The pandemic taught the world to expect the unexpected. This tax shock may teach the world to build for the unpredictable. So what happens now? Does Vietnam become the new Guangzhou? Will India finally fulfill its Make in India dream? Or will the manufacturing world splinter into micro-hubs, none as powerful as China, but all more resilient? And as the engines fall silent in China's factory belt, as entrepreneurs shut their doors, as brands scramble to print new shipping labels, one question cuts through the smoke. Is this the end of China's dominance, or just the beginning of a world without any single manufacturing superpower? If you value this perspective, consider subscribing to Worldview today and sharing it with someone who still believes in critical thinking.